far beneath the surface of the Earth, beyond the reach of sunlight, beyond the familiar layers of fossil-rich rock. A discovery has emerged that defies expectation. In a remote excavation site, buried within ancient sedimentary deposits thought to be thoroughly explored, paleontologists uncovered something they could not immediately explain. It was not the size that unsettled them, nor the depth at which it was found, but its form. A fossil unlike any recorded before, bearing features that seemed to belong to multiple branches of life, yet fitting neatly into none. At first glance, it appeared fragmented, distorted by immense geological pressure over millions of years. But as layers of surrounding rock were carefully removed, a clearer image began to take shape. A creature with an anatomical structure that challenged long-standing assumptions about prehistoric evolution. Limbs that suggested movement in ways not previously considered. A skeletal arrangement that hinted at a lineage lost, or perhaps never fully understood. The deeper they excavated, the more unsettling the discovery became. To understand the significance of this fossil, one must journey back through time, into an ancient world vastly different from our own. A time when continents were still shifting, climates were unstable, and life itself was experimenting with forms that would shape the future of evolution. The rock layer in which the fossil was found dates back approximately 310 million years, placing it within the late Carboniferous period. During this era, Earth was dominated by vast swamp forests, dense with towering lycophytes, giant ferns, and early seed-bearing plants. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere were significantly higher than today, allowing arthropods to grow to enormous sizes and enabling ecosystems to thrive with remarkable diversity. This was a world teeming with life, yet still in the early stages of terrestrial colonization. Vertebrates had only recently begun to explore land environments, evolving from aquatic ancestors into forms capable of surviving beyond water. It is within this transitional moment in Earth's history that the strange fossil begins to reveal its context. The excavation site itself lies deep within a region once covered by ancient wetlands. Over millions of years, layers of sediment accumulated, compressing organic material into coal seams and preserving the remains of long-extinct organisms. Fossils from this period are not uncommon. Remnants of amphibians, early reptiles, and plant life have been studied extensively. But this specimen was different. Careful analysis of the surrounding matrix suggested that the fossil had not been transported by water or disturbed after burial. It appeared to have been preserved exactly where the organism had died, a rare and valuable circumstance that allowed scientists to reconstruct not only its anatomy, but potentially its behavior and environment. As preparators worked to expose the fossil in laboratory conditions, its structure became increasingly clear. The creature measured roughly 1.2 meters in length, small by later prehistoric standards, but significant for its time. Its body was elongated, with a flexible spine composed of numerous vertebrae. At first glance, it resembled early tetrapods, vertebrates that had adapted to life both in water and on land. However, several features immediately set it apart. The limbs, for instance, were unusually structured. Instead of the typical arrangement seen in early amphibians, this creature's limbs exhibited a hybrid morphology. The forelimbs were robust, with joint articulations suggesting strong muscle attachments, possibly for digging or anchoring itself in soft substrates. Yet the hind limbs were elongated and slender, more reminiscent of creatures adapted for swimming. This asymmetry raised immediate questions. Was the creature amphibious, semi-aquatic, or something entirely different? Further examination revealed even more puzzling details. The skull, partially crushed but largely intact, displayed a combination of characteristics not typically found together. The jaw structure suggested a carnivorous diet, with small, sharp teeth ideal for gripping slippery prey. Yet the placement of the eye sockets indicated a field of vision optimized not just for hunting, but for detecting movement in multiple directions. Even more unusual was the presence of a series of ridges along the spine, bony protrusions that may have supported soft tissue structures. Some scientists speculated that these could have anchored a primitive fin or membrane, potentially used for stabilization in water. But perhaps the most confounding feature was found within the ribcage. Embedded among the preserved bones were faint impressions, traces of soft tissue that had mineralized over time. These structures did not match any known respiratory system from the period. They appeared more complex than simple amphibian lungs, yet lacked the defining characteristics of fully developed reptilian respiration. It was as if this organism occupied a space between established evolutionary pathways. As the analysis continued, paleontologists began comparing the fossil to known species from the Carboniferous period. Early tetrapods such as Ichthyostega and Acanthostega provided some points of reference, but the similarities were superficial at best. This new specimen did not fit neatly into the existing evolutionary tree. Instead, it suggested the existence of a previously unknown lineage, one that may have evolved in isolation, adapting to a unique ecological niche within the ancient wetlands. The implications of such a discovery are profound. If this creature represents a distinct evolutionary branch, it challenges the traditional view of how vertebrates transitioned from water to land. Rather than a linear progression, evolution may have involved multiple parallel experiments, diverse forms emerging simultaneously, each exploring different survival strategies. In this context, the strange fossil becomes more than just an anomaly. It becomes evidence of a broader, more complex evolutionary landscape. To better understand this organism, scientists turned to advanced imaging techniques. High-resolution scans allowed them to peer inside the fossil without damaging it, revealing internal structures that had remained hidden for hundreds of millions of years. What they found only deepened the mystery. The internal bone density varied significantly throughout the skeleton. Certain regions were unusually dense, suggesting adaptations for weight-bearing or resistance to pressure. Other areas were lighter, possibly indicating buoyancy control or flexibility. This pattern hinted at a creature capable of navigating both aquatic and terrestrial environments, but in a way that differed from known amphibians. It may have moved through water with ease, using its elongated hind limbs for propulsion. On land, its powerful forelimbs could have allowed it to pull itself across soft, unstable terrain, perhaps even burrowing into sediment to escape predators or harsh conditions. This dual adaptation suggests a highly specialized lifestyle. Yet despite these insights, many questions remain unanswered. Why did this lineage not persist? What environmental pressures led to its eventual extinction? And perhaps most intriguingly, are there more fossils like it still hidden beneath layers of ancient rock? The discovery site continues to be explored, with teams carefully excavating deeper layers in search of additional specimens. Each fragment recovered adds to the growing puzzle, offering new clues about a world long vanished. But the fossil itself remains at the center of the mystery, a silent witness to a time when life was still experimenting with its possibilities, when the boundaries between land and water were fluid, and evolution had not yet settled into the patterns we recognize today. In the dim light of the laboratory, surrounded by tools and instruments, the fossil rests, its ancient bones telling a story that scientists are only beginning to understand. And as they study its structure, its environment, and its place in the grand timeline of life, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is not just a strange fossil. It is a glimpse into a forgotten chapter of Earth's history, one that may redefine what we thought we knew about the origins of life on land. And the deeper they look, the more that certainty begins to unravel. The initial discovery had already unsettled the established understanding of early vertebrate evolution, but what followed in the weeks after the fossil's extraction pushed the investigation into even deeper uncertainty. As laboratories refined their analysis, and as sediment samples from the excavation site were subjected to increasingly precise geochemical testing, the site itself began to reveal a far more complex history than anyone had anticipated. What had first appeared to be an isolated fossil was now emerging as part of a broader and more intricate geological narrative, one that suggested repeated biological activity within the same ancient deposit over extended periods of time. Paleontologists returned to the field location with expanded equipment, extending the excavation grid both laterally and vertically into deeper strata. Each new layer of sediment told a slightly different story of the Carboniferous world: cycles of flooding, stagnation, plant overgrowth, and gradual decay, all compressed into a dense archive of ancient environmental change. It was within one of these deeper layers that the second anomaly was discovered. Unlike the first specimen, which had been largely intact despite deformation, this new find appeared fragmented in a deliberate and unusual pattern. The bones were not scattered randomly by geological forces. Instead, they seemed to follow a loose anatomical alignment, as though the organism had been partially disarticulated before burial, or possibly subjected to environmental pressures that selectively preserved only certain skeletal components. The implications of this possibility were significant. If the arrangement was not random, then the fossil record at this site might be preserving behavioral or ecological interactions rather than isolated deaths. As the fragments were carefully extracted, researchers began to notice a striking similarity to the original specimen. The vertebral structure, limb proportions, and cranial fragments all suggested a closely related organism. Yet subtle differences in bone morphology indicated that this was not simply another example of the same species. Instead, it appeared to represent a variant, either a closely related evolutionary offshoot or a distinct population adapted to a slightly different ecological niche within the same ancient wetland system. Back in the laboratory, high-resolution micro-CT scanning was employed to reconstruct both specimens in 3 dimensions. The digital models allowed scientists to compare internal bone structures without risking damage to the fragile fossils. What emerged from this reconstruction deepened the mystery further. The first specimen showed a relatively balanced skeletal distribution, with bone density optimized for both aquatic propulsion and terrestrial support. The second, however, displayed a marked shift in structural emphasis. Its forelimbs were significantly more robust, with reinforced joint articulation and thicker cortical bone layers, suggesting a lifestyle that demanded greater physical force in the anterior body region. This adaptation pointed toward a behavioral divergence between the two organisms. One may have been more aquatic, the other more terrestrial or semi-subterranean. Yet both shared the same unusual cranial architecture, including the distinctive jaw morphology and multidirectional orbital positioning. This consistency implied a shared lineage, reinforcing the idea of a previously unknown evolutionary branch rather than isolated anomalies. To understand the environment that could support such diversity, geochemists turned to isotopic analysis of the surrounding sediment layers. Ratios of oxygen and carbon isotopes revealed fluctuations in water temperature and vegetation density over time, painting a picture of an ecosystem in constant transition. The ancient wetland was not a stable habitat. It was a shifting mosaic of shallow pools, dense swamp forests, and periodic drought conditions that reshaped the landscape repeatedly over thousands of years. Such instability would have placed intense selective pressure on any organism attempting to survive within it. Flexibility, both anatomical and behavioral, would have been essential. And yet, the fossil evidence suggested something even more unusual than adaptation alone. Within the sediment surrounding both specimens, microscopic traces of organic residue were detected. These residues, preserved as carbonized films, showed patterns that did not align with simple decay processes. Instead, they appeared in localized clusters, as if biological material had been concentrated or processed in specific areas of the environment. Some researchers proposed a controversial hypothesis, that these organisms may not have been purely solitary hunters or opportunistic feeders, but part of a more structured ecological network than previously assumed for vertebrates of this period. While there is no direct evidence of complex social behavior, the spatial arrangement of the fossils, combined with the clustering of organic residues, has led to cautious speculation about possible aggregation sites, areas where multiple individuals may have gathered under specific environmental conditions. If true, this would represent a significant departure from established models of Carboniferous vertebrate behavior. Meanwhile, further excavation deeper in the strata revealed something entirely unexpected. A third fossil layer emerged, this one containing partial impressions rather than fully preserved skeletal material. These impressions were embedded in fine-grained clay deposits, suggesting a sudden burial event, possibly triggered by flooding or rapid sediment collapse. Within these impressions, paleontologists identified repeated structural patterns, fragmentary limb traces, vertebral impressions, and elongated body outlines. Although incomplete, They strongly resembled the anatomical signature of the previously discovered specimens. However, the arrangement of these impressions was different. They were distributed in a radial pattern, extending outward from a central point within the sediment layer. This configuration raised new questions about the conditions under which these organisms lived and died. One interpretation suggested a sudden environmental catastrophe, such as a rapid influx of water or toxic gas release within the swamp ecosystem. Another, more speculative interpretation proposed that these organisms may have been responding collectively to an environmental stimulus, converging toward or dispersing from a central location. Neither explanation could be confirmed, but both pointed toward a level of ecological complexity that extended beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. As the laboratory phase of the investigation progressed, attention shifted toward the fossilized bone microstructure itself. Under electron microscopy, the bone tissue revealed an unexpected level of vascular complexity. Channels within the bone suggested a highly efficient nutrient delivery system, more advanced than typical early tetrapods of the Carboniferous period. This raised an important evolutionary question. Was this organism more derived than its geological age would suggest? Or does it represent an entirely separate evolutionary experiment that developed advanced traits independently? The concept of convergent evolution offered one possible explanation. In isolated environments with strong selective pressures, unrelated lineages can sometimes develop similar adaptations. However, the combination of traits observed in these fossils, semi-aquatic limb structures, complex cranial orientation, and advanced bone vascularization, made simple convergence less satisfactory as a complete explanation. Instead, some researchers began to consider a more radical possibility, that the evolutionary timeline of early vertebrates may contain undocumented branches that never fully integrated into the lineages leading to modern animals. If such branches existed, they could fundamentally alter the way scientists interpret the fossil record of the Carboniferous period. As discussions intensified within the paleontological community, the excavation site itself continued to yield subtle but important clues. Additional fragmentary remains, too incomplete to classify definitively, were discovered at increasing depth. Each new find reinforced the idea that the original fossil was not an isolated curiosity, but part of a broader and more complex biological presence within this ancient ecosystem. And yet, despite all these discoveries, the central mystery remained unresolved. What exactly were these organisms? Why did they appear in such a constrained geological region? And why does their anatomy seem to resist classification within any known evolutionary framework? The deeper the investigation went, the more the fossil record seemed to resist clarity. Instead of providing answers, it was revealing a pattern of increasing complexity, one that suggested the existence of an ancient ecosystem far more diverse and unpredictable than previously imagined. As the final samples from this phase of the excavation were cataloged and stored for further study, the research team prepared to push even deeper into the geological record, because it was becoming increasingly clear that the most important discoveries had not yet been made. And somewhere beneath the layers already uncovered, in sediments untouched for hundreds of millions of years, the Earth still held onto secrets that refused to be fully revealed. And somewhere beneath the layers already uncovered, in sediments untouched for hundreds of millions of years, the Earth still held onto secrets that refused to be fully revealed. The decision to continue deeper was not made lightly. By this stage, the excavation had already pushed the limits of both logistical endurance and scientific expectation. The strata surrounding the original discovery had become increasingly unstable, requiring reinforced support systems to prevent collapse. Yet despite the risks, the team proceeded downward, guided by a growing conviction that the most significant evidence had not yet been reached. What they eventually encountered was a layer unlike any above it. The sediment changed in composition abruptly. Fine-grained mudstone gave way to a dense, darkened band of mineral-rich clay, saturated with iron deposits and microscopic crystalline structures. Geologists immediately recognized this as a marker of environmental disruption, an ancient boundary layer formed under conditions of sudden ecological stress. It was within this boundary that the fossil record transformed entirely. Unlike the fragmented and partial remains found above, This new layer contained an extraordinary level of preservation. Entire impressions of organisms were embedded within the rock, captured in momentary detail as if time itself had briefly paused before sealing them away. But what made this layer truly remarkable was not just preservation, it was arrangement. The fossils were not randomly distributed. They formed structured patterns across the sediment surface, repeating in elongated pathways that extended in parallel lines through the rock. These pathways were not consistent with water currents or geological compression. Instead, they resembled organized movement. Trackways began to emerge. At first, they were faint, bare impressions pressed into the ancient substrate. But as more of the layer was exposed, the patterns became undeniable. Multiple sets of tracks, all belonging to creatures matching the anatomical signature of the earlier fossils, moved in coordinated directions across the landscape. Some tracks showed dragging impressions from elongated hind limbs. Others revealed deeper forelimb punctures, suggesting weight-bearing movement through soft, unstable terrain. The directionality of these trackways was consistent, converging toward a single geological point deep within the excavation zone. At the center of this convergence lay the most astonishing discovery yet: a nearly complete specimen. Unlike the previous fossils, which had been compressed and partially destroyed by time, this individual was preserved with unusual clarity. The skeleton was articulated, limbs positioned in natural alignment, as though the organism had come to rest gently rather than being violently buried. Its size exceeded the earlier specimens by nearly 40%. But more importantly, its anatomy revealed something previously unseen. The spinal ridges, once thought to be simple structural features, were far more pronounced in this individual. They extended outward in subtle arcs, suggesting the presence of soft tissue structures that may have functioned as stabilizing membranes or sensory extensions. The ribcage was expanded, not compressed, indicating a respiratory capacity greater than previously assumed. And the skull, so carefully preserved, showed a level of complexity that changed the direction of interpretation entirely. Microscopic analysis of the cranial cavity revealed expanded neural regions associated with sensory integration. This suggested that the organism may have possessed a heightened ability to process environmental stimuli, particularly vibration and pressure changes within both water and sediment. In other words, this was not simply a transitional creature between aquatic and terrestrial life. It may have been highly specialized for a very specific ecological niche. As further analysis continued, attention shifted to the surrounding sediment matrix. Within the immediate burial zone of the complete specimen, geochemical anomalies were detected. Elevated concentrations of sulfur compounds and methane-derived minerals suggested that the surrounding environment had undergone sudden chemical changes at the time of burial. One prevailing hypothesis began to emerge. This was not a slow accumulation of remains over time. It was a catastrophic event. A sudden environmental collapse, possibly triggered by a methane release, volcanic intrusion, or rapid flooding of an oxygen-depleted wetland, may have sealed an entire localized ecosystem in a single geological moment. This interpretation explained the preservation, the trackways, and the clustering of multiple individuals in the deeper layers. But it also raised a new and unsettling possibility. If multiple individuals of the same organism were present within such a confined region, then this was not an isolated species known from a few scattered fossils. It may have been a dominant component of this ancient ecosystem. As the excavation expanded further outward from the central burial site, additional evidence began to surface. Smaller individuals were discovered in close proximity to the larger specimen, their skeletal structures less developed but clearly sharing the same anatomical framework. This suggested a range of growth stages preserved together, as if an entire population had been captured in a single moment of geological time. Juvenile forms displayed proportionally larger heads and less developed limb structures, indicating a different mode of locomotion in early life stages. This ontogenetic shift implied a complex life cycle, one that may have included significant habitat transitions as the organism matured. Aquatic in youth, perhaps, and increasingly terrestrial or subterranean in adulthood. This multi-stage development aligned with the earlier hypothesis of a dual-environment lifestyle, but now with far greater biological depth than previously understood. Yet even this interpretation struggled to account for all observed features. One of the most puzzling discoveries came from trace analysis of the surrounding clay. Embedded within the sediment were microscopic grooves, fine, repeating structures that did not correspond to known biological or geological processes. Under magnification, these grooves appeared to form branching networks beneath the surface layer of the ancient wetland.